Hello, everyone, and welcome in. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Demystifying CTEM for CISOs. Before we get started, I just have a couple of things to go over. The first is that we are recording this session and we will be sharing it out shortly after we finish up. And the second is that we do have a question feature available. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please add them to the bottom of the screen where you see the little question mark box, and we will have some time to answer them at the end. With that, we can just go ahead and get started. So again, everyone, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Demystifying CTEM for CISOs. Today, I'm joined by Pete Lubin, Field CISO at AttackIQ, and Jose Barajas, Field Engineer at AttackIQ. I will hand it over to you guys to get started.
Awesome. Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's session. Some of you may or may not have heard of CTEM. Then that's exactly why we brought you here today, is to kind of give you some insights into what CTEM is and give you a little bit of perspective on how AttackIQ is approaching CTEM. So, the agenda for today, we'll just walk you through. First, start off with a little bit of today's securities challenges, walk you through some of the things I like to share when I give some talks typically there. From there, just give you a little bit about, how the kind of landscape's changing. BAS is now adversary exposure validation. And then there's an even bigger change, which is what we're here to talk about today, which is CTEM. So from there, we'll talk a little bit of intro to CTEM and what the concept is and how it's applied. And then finally, a little bit of focus on what we're providing to your organizations, which is, the ability to reduce exposures through the CTEM process. And we'll really deep dive into that. And then we'll finish up with a demo just to walk you through that. So that's what we have in store for you today. Please ask any questions along the way. We'll monitor that and answer them in the spot or at the end. But also we'll be asking questions throughout the session. So please feel free to answer that so you can see where your peers stand throughout. So that's what we have for you guys today. And let me go ahead and just jump right in and let's talk about a little bit about, today's security challenges. And, to start, this is a metric I'm still surprised a lot of folks don't recognize when we see it, but this is from the Verizon DBIR report. AttackIQ's been providing feedback to that report for a number of years now. But at the end of the day, what it says is 82% of breaches should have been stopped, but they weren't. And the reason for that was not because they didn't have the right capability, is that those controls were just simply not managed correctly at the moment when the event occurred. So the idea is that, we all have the right technologies. What we don't have necessarily is maybe the right configurations, the right processes, the right kind of management around these technologies. And that's kind of why we're in the situation that we're in. And also why here at AttackIQ, we've focused around testing and supporting, the organization and making decisions about their program and their security controls. Now, with that said, the other thing that, I like to share here, and this is, for us, that about 70% of our customers reported that the controls were not working when they started. So, at the end of the day, I think a lot of us, nowadays, I don't really get the pushback, but, I've been doing this for 10 years now. And, early on, people would say, why do I need to test my controls? Of course they're working, right? And I think, nowadays, I think people come from that perspective and assume, the worst and then work towards that. But we're still seeing that most of our customers do find issues that, they didn't expect. And I'll just share one story. I'll work with folks and ask them to run something very simple like Mimikatz. I almost always get pushback, but you'll be surprised how many times this malware from 25 years ago is still successful in orgs because of misconfigurations. And that's a blatant piece of software that should not be able to run anywhere, yet it does. So these are the kind of things that we're observing, and this is exactly why you should be testing, right? A little bit more about what your actual, end of the day, your SOCs are kind of dealing with. From the perspective of, 53% of them, things are changing, right? I mean, 10 years ago, SaaS was a thing, but not as prevalent as it is today. Most of you are doing some sort of transformation project, moving to a cloud-first kind of strategy, as an example. But nowadays, we're all dealing with, LLMs and ChatGPTs and, all that stuff being pervasive in our environment. And how do we balance, the benefits that the business gets, while still maintaining security? So I think, 5 years from now, we're going to be talking about yet the other, technological change. I think that's something that we're dealing with. The other thing too is, the mean dwell time in environments before detection. Again, this is why we want to help you tune those technologies very well and give you insights so you can stay ahead of them. Through some of the things that we're offering today. And then finally, just the cost of breaches just continue to go up year over year. So this is what your team is dealing with day to day, and obviously we want to help provide some solutions to support that. Pete, I know you deal a lot, with a lot of this stuff as an operator. Anything you want to add here?
Yeah, I mean, in my former life, obviously disparate controls and managing multiple vendors, becomes difficult, especially when you talk about the cohesiveness of integrations and sort of the different languages and data types that you have to consume. But one of the other challenges that I'm sure we all understand is like, look, the security team, might run a portion of the portfolio of the control space, but your infrastructure team probably runs your firewalls and your dev team runs your pipelines. Like maintaining that cohesion across different lines of organizational separation, doesn't make the problem any easier. As we talk more about CTEM when we get to it in a little bit, I think we'll start to see how really that framework helps us start to think about how to deal with challenges like that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, definitely. I think silos tends to be the biggest problem I see in organizations at this point.
Yep.
Doing what I do here, I talk to hundreds of them, and again, it's not the technology, it's not the implementation, but we all have all these different groups that just operate separately. So I just double click on that. A lot of times it's a people problem we got to solve, and I know that's a kind of a cliche to say, but it really is. But we can help bridge the gap, to some degree with some of the technology stuff that we're going to talk about today. Last thing, and then we'll definitely get into a concept of reduced exposures next. As an operator, we always talk about, doing as much as we can, for those of you in the military, left of boom or left of bang, right? And we want to do more and more to help support that. So we've released a number of products this year at Black Hat to help support that, in order to stay left of the breach, some threat intelligence products. Watchtower, if you haven't seen them, I highly recommend you check that out. And what we're going to focus on today is around, attack surface discovery and attack path discovery. That is another capability that we introduced to the market through an acquisition earlier this year. But what we're going to focus on today is kind of exposure validation. We want to find those exposures before the attacker has an opportunity to do so, and then we can, implement a correct plan to kind of address that. So that's what we're going to focus on today is exposure validation through the process of CTEM that we facilitate here at AttackIQ. But just wanted to show you, really what we're focused on is really helping our customers shift less as much as possible with all the data and context that we have in order to support them. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about, I think, how, this kind of came to be. Starting with a little bit about, maybe about, how these kind of worlds, we talked about silos, so maybe we can talk a little bit about how they came together. Pete, I'll let you kind of walk us through how the vulnerable and the security world kind of started to come together here.
Yeah. So a couple of weeks ago, I did one of these webinars, and if y'all caught it, my buddy Ben and I were riffing on, the concept of vulnerability management and how it exists in the enterprise and how it existed in the past versus what it looks like today, but also that concept versus what we're now talking about, which is exposure management. As we know, vulnerability management is the thing that you must do, but it's only a slice of the pie. Vulnerabilities only represent a certain dimension of exposure. Misconfiguration and security controls, overprivileged identities, ports and protocols listening on exposed assets that you're not aware of. These are all non-CVE exposures, that we need to be worried about. And so comprehensively, yes, vulnerability management, but also your security controls, their configuration, and knowing through validation that your configurations are in such a way that they are tuned and prepared to defend against exposures specific to you, your organization, your geo, your industry, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just, hey, my firewall blocks everything. It doesn't. Obviously, it doesn't. The business wouldn't work if it did. So when we start to talk about exposure management, we're talking about taking a completely different view up to and including vulnerability management, but all that other good stuff. And we'll get into attack path mapping because traditionally, attack path mapping was a thing that we all did or attempted to do very manually. and was very difficult to do. And again, we get into this, quote unquote, people problem. You relied on infrastructure to know what your network looked like. You relied on your asset teams and even your help desk to know what the user space looks like or what the server space looks like. You needed visual representations of those things. You needed reference architectures of those things, and you had to piece all of those things together and then try and overlay your control framework and so on and so forth. It was arduous and overly difficult, and so people didn't do it. It was a huge consumption of resources and a lot of times a giant waste of time. But that's where CTEM comes in. Um, we're talking not anymore about the hypothetical. What do I worry about? How do I manage my environment? What am I doing about it? And what the end result is. Now we're attempting to do that in a cohesive framework that is this sort of continuous loop of all the components of CTEM, and we'll get into that here.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. And I think, this is, I say it all the time, these are the two sides of the same coin, and, the context matters, in both directions. And again, this is what we're trying to put together here as part of that capability. And, overall, just to give you guys a sense, definitely we're seeing the market shift. So, just a little bit of background here. Traditionally we've been a breach and attack simulation company. Today we're talking about CTEM. And Gartner also kind of redid the category of BAS into this category called the adversary exposure validation. So, I think this is a good example of how, just doing a pen test is just not good enough. That's why that pen test category has been pulled into the adversary exposure validation, because we need to do beyond just pen testing, do some actual testing post, post kind of compromise and inside of the environment, which is what typically a pen test doesn't cover. So I think just an example of how the market is shifting, and obviously, the analysts like Gartner are calling that out as they rename things like BAS into AV, because it's just the deeper needs for further testing across the spectrum, not just what we've been doing traditionally, and because of regulatory requirements, right? Now, in terms of CTEM, AttackIQ, just to give you guys a quick sense, we did buy a company back in January called Deep Surface. So as we're walking you through this is actually a marriage between, the capabilities they had focus on vulnerability prioritization based on attack path mapping, and then the capabilities that we've had here at AttackIQ, which is, threat-informed defense validation of your controls, right? And that's really how we're putting this together as part of a process. Now, at a very high level, and this is the architecture that we see from the analysts, with CTEM really composes of 5 steps that we're going to walk through here, starting with, kind of scoping. I think this is where it's important. Pete mentioned earlier, understanding, what we're going to focus on, what are the areas that matter, those sort of things. Helping support discovery. A big issue that we see with a lot of CISOs is just the visibility that they have. I think, we've worked with organizations where they struggle to get, more than an X percentage of assets to be online at any given time, the endpoint, right? So this discovery, yet another way of discovering it, is kind of useful. And Pete, anything you want to add there? I see you nodding along.
Yeah, just so I've written posts and stuff before throughout my career, suggesting that visibility is the CISO's best friend, and that's 100% the case. But there's so much to unpack there, right? I'd say show of hands, but I can't see anybody's hands. But like, who has a fully functioning authoritative asset management CMDB that is up to date, current, and comprehensive? I don't know if anybody's raising their hands. I can't raise my hand because I've never successfully achieved that in a way where it was manageable over time and dynamic enough over time, and the army across the entire organization that it takes to keep that thing current. It's just a job that not everybody is willing to do, and so that thing fades. When we talk about visibility through the lens of discovery, we need smarter ways to discover all of the things. One of the challenges in the past, and Jose alluded to this, is not all of your assets are online all of the time. You may not be able to check in with a user asset every single day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so you need to be able to be doing that discovery continuously, because that picture, the story that your discovery, that your asset management is telling you, needs to continually update so that you've got visibility into your operating environment with the freshest, most available data you can have at any given time. And we'll get more into that obviously as we go through this thing. But discovery is this huge thing that for years and years and years we've been trying to solve, and I think we're making excellent progress there.
Yeah, and we'll definitely touch on how we do this a little bit later, but obviously just having multiple ways to kind of verify the different sources and have all the different pieces of context in one place is a very important piece of that. These are things that you probably have access to, but we talked about working across departments. It may be difficult to get that context from a different department or to get to in a continuous manner so that it's relevant and timely, right? So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more, how we facilitate that. In the last three steps here, prioritization is really taking all the context across. If we just take a simple example like CVEs versus MITRE ATT&CK, you'll see as I'll show you later, but there might be a low CVSS score vulnerability that the team doesn't want to patch in 90 days. But when we look at it from a MITRE ATT&CK lens, that same vulnerability is being actively used in the wild today by a threat actor, right? These are the kind of silos that are built. But again, we want to bring that together and bring that context in so that we can do prioritization. And then validation, I think, this is our sweet spot here at AttackIQ. We've been validating controls, capabilities, and processes for a number of years. And then most importantly, I think the mobilization piece. And this is where now that we have all our pieces in front of us, we can make an informed decision about what the team should be focusing on, today, whether it's an active threat that we're seeing, whether it's a specific vulnerability that should be addressed given the additional context. But mobilization, I think at the end of the day, this is where the way I see it is really us laying out all the pieces in front of you as a CISO, so you can make a decision about what should be done next, right? So that's kind of what we're striving to do here as part of CTEM. Anything you want to add, here, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, CTEM. So I'll try not to go on a huge tirade about this here. So look, the concept of CTEM, what it's intended to do, is not new. It is what we as CISOs have been trying to do our entire lives. Know all of the things, figure out where they all are, figure out which of those things is important to us, make sure that our controls are doing what they're supposed to be doing to interdict threat, and do things, fix things, change things constantly. CTEM introduces this concept as a life cycle with specific phases, with specific goals, and it's intended to be done continuously. I think we've all strived to have a program that deals with all of the things constantly and continuously. And it's been difficult because the brain space is a difficult one to pack into one's own head, let alone to get the rest of the organization to understand it comprehensively. I'll give you an example, and I'll use vulnerabilities as an example because it's my favorite, least favorite thing in the world. When I plug in my vuln scanner and I run my first assessment, and it tells me I've got 40,000 vulnerabilities in the environment, ranging from critical to nobody cares and everywhere in between, and there's a bunch of KEVs in there and so on and so forth. And I go into the room with my team and my infrastructure team and my dev team and the people who own assets, and I say, cool, here's 40,000 vulnerabilities, go patch them all. Like, the looks you're going to get are going to be ridiculous. Like, you're going to have a bunch of people who are just going to get up and leave, and that's historically been a huge challenge. CTEM, especially through the lens of discovery and prioritization and validation, gives you a way to bring a human understandable conversation to the room to say, hey, yeah, we got 40,000 vulnerabilities, but we understand, these 10 of them represent 80% of the risk in the environment. So, hey, let's get together and go address those things first. It's concepts like that that make CTEM revolutionary, even though it represents what we've been trying to do forever.
Absolutely. And with that, let's talk a little bit about how we are supporting kind of the CTEM process, and starting with the exposure score, which is kind of the primary metric that we're providing here. The idea here with the exposure score is going to be around the fact that we can give you kind of one solid score based around the context and understanding of what are the possible attack paths that we've been able to either confirm or not, and then give you a score based on how we're improving the environment, where we currently are in terms of critical assets that you've been able to identify, right, and that all the actionable items that have been identified as critical are actually being addressed, right, as part of the process. So this is kind of the primary metric that we're providing you, through this process. Now, the way that we arrive at that is going to be, again, just to show you how it actually implements in the product, and we'll definitely demo this at the end. But starting first and foremost with discovery. At AttackIQ, the reason I really love the way that we've implemented this and this concept that's been brought to the market and we're implementing on our side is the question I've been getting since day one is what should I be testing today, right? And we just jump into testing directly. But with this process of CTEM, we're actually focusing on, first of all, let's see what we can discover. And we do that from the perspective of doing discovery, through the current processes that we have in order to continuously discover that environment, either with things where we do have permission or we don't have permission. What I mean by that is we might just pull data from some of your technologies, like your EDR and your vulnerability manager, but we'll also, use the historic MITRE TTPs that we employ to also see, let's do a scan and see what we discover, and let's capture that context so you can have that as part of the process. From there, we can continuously run these discoveries as part of a process through our ITSM or through the agents that we have deployed within the product. And with that context, what we'll do is we'll actually go ahead and identify where we see exposure concentration. Essentially, where do we see, say, a specific asset being able to reach the critical parts of my infrastructure, and I identify those through the attack path mapping concept that we have. And then from there, as we see the possible attack paths, we can either verify that that attack path is actually possible, meaning I could actually reach that database and steal, for example, user credentials, user details, PII, something like that, right? Or the compensating control is effective. And that's where we're taking those two sides, which is like, what is a possible attack path? Validating out which ones are true or not, and then finally kind of summarizing it based on the number of paths that we see and the access to a specific entity or asset within your environment, whether it's a network, an identity, or a specific machine. We can start to kind of put together that score. And today we have this rubric, which we can get into maybe at another time. But we are basing this on a lot of the research that we did with MITRE as part of the M3 TIP project. So it's not something that we just came up here at AttackIQ, and it's something that we work with the community to build and are using that as a basis for the score as well as part of that. And one big metric here that we're focusing on is exposure, and the way that we're calculating this exposure score, again, just to get a little bit more detail for you, is this is a focus around the specific assets within the environment, the probability that that specific asset is being involved in an incident, and then the impact of that asset, meaning as we pull in data from your vuln scanners or your team identifies the critical assets, if we can reach those, that's what's going to affect this overall score that we've developed here. And then just to show you the breakdown of how we, actually in reality kind of break that out, we're taking a look at things like vulnerability data. Again, we're taking a look at vulnerability data, CVEs, specifically KEVs that we've observed. We're taking into account the control effectiveness. You have a bunch of controls. Are they operational and working and effective? And then finally, based on those two variables, and then what we can actually impact through these attack paths that we've built, and we'll show you after this, that's how we calculate the breach impact based on the values you set for these assets that you see on the right. And then, this is essentially at the end of the day is how we can, the last component that we do to calculate out is going to be the discovery coverage. So how much discovery is actually occurring across your environment, and then across your environment, how much are we validating? So these are, quite a bit of detail that I'm throwing here in front of you, but these are all the variables that are, helping you define that score. And then, I'll show you next how the attack paths work and the details behind this. But this is how we're essentially, coming together with this exposure score that you can then use as a basis to show improvement over time, right? Or calculate how not implementing something might affect things. Anything you want to add before we actually walk through and show some of these attack paths, Pete?
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty simple and goes back to what I was saying earlier, right? Like visibility is key. Know the state of the state in your environment. Be sure that you're able to validate the effectiveness of your controls, and understand what's going to happen if you don't, right? Discovery is one of the most, if not the most critical aspect of the CTEM framework. The more you know about your environment, the more you can affect change. And that's basically what it is that we're talking about here.
Yeah, and speaking of discovery, what we'll do, and this is where I'm going to start to walk you through it and show you exactly what we mean by some of these, how it plays out in the product anyways. when we look at discovery data and context that we have there, what we'll do is we'll take that discovery data and that vuln data and actually start to build some attack paths. And this is an example where we have just one example attack path, based on the possible paths that we have to reach the vulnerable asset on the right. That's how we're calculating the probability of an incident. And then from here, we can see the vulnerable asset. Each asset is going to be assigned a score, which is going to help your team, the technical team, be able to quickly understand what's most important to you based on what attack paths can reach what vulnerable asset is part of that. Now, as we create this and we start, this is at this point a plausible attack path, right? I'm making an inference based on the context, the details, and information that I have about what this this possible attack path is. And this is where we can start to merge the two technologies together and give you real context. Where in our case, well, we said that our poisoning as an example was something that occurred at this stage. Let's attempt that and validate whether the compensating controls are effective or not. And this is where what we've been doing here historically at AttackIQ works together to then, for example, validate out, in this case, all the different technologies that I have in my environment and help me understand whether this attack path is actually possible. And if it is, well, we probably want to prioritize that if the customer data is an important thing to us, probably is, right? But if we find the attack path is possible, is not possible because our compensating controls are working, then that's great, right? We can focus on other areas. But that's the idea here, is that the more context that you give us, the more plausible attack paths we can build, and then validate them out so that your team can focus on the actual attack paths that are able to reach, in this example, the customer database there at the end. And then the last thing I'll call out here is going to be around, how we summarize a lot of this information, especially to your analysts. We have this concept called weaknesses. So, for example, we just talked about an endpoint blocking credential theft. Well, maybe that wasn't actually blocked. What we will raise here is we'll actually raise it to your team in a weakness. We'll let you know how prevalent that weakness is across one business unit, multiple business unit, one asset, multiple assets. And then we can translate this context. So for those of you that may have, maybe you're a technical CISO and you love presenting things in a MITRE ATT&CK, but you have to work with your CIO. We can actually translate the weaknesses and prioritize them based on asset types, right? Is it a network that's being compromised? Is it an identity that's being compromised? We can kind of redisplay the weaknesses based on that. And then the other perspective that we can rotate this on is around technologies. So we're talking to the operator that manages the firewall. We can show them the weaknesses for just their firewall. So it's really a nice human readable way for us to communicate with other stakeholders like the board. This is going to be very human readable, not MITRE ATT&CK-ish, which may be too much for them, or something that can be very focused on, well, what does it mean to me as the operator of the firewall? Well, these are the 5 weaknesses that I need you to focus on and address. So it's really a nice way of kind of summarizing the things that we find there. Any thoughts before I jump into the demo, Pete, that you want to add here?
Yeah, I just want to attempt to emphasize the importance of what Jose just said, right? Like having been a CISO and having been in the boardroom many times, you know how those conversations go when you show up with technical information, or if you show up speaking a language that only security folks understand. It goes very poorly. And it's not just in the boardroom. You can't necessarily expect your development community to understand those things either, like what's MITRE, right? When you need help desk people to do things and you want to give them context as to why they're doing it, like it helps to be able to frame it in terms of, a language, a human readable language, that particular group of human beings is going to connect to. And you'll see in AttackIQ products in our roadmap and some of the stuff we just introduced and many of the things that are coming in the future, is there is a focus on being able to present findings using natural language and being able to interface with our platforms using natural language. That's a theme, and I think that breaks many barriers that have been challenges for CISOs in the past.
Excellent. Well, with that, team, let's transition to the demo and actually show you what we've been talking about so far. So let me reshare my screen here. Cool. All right, so this is the AttackIQ CTEM product. I'm going to just give you a quick demo of it so you can understand how it comes together in practice, some of the concepts that we just walked through. So to start, we can see here, this is the dashboard where we started. We can see and have an understanding of all the different discovery and objects that we can see in our environment. I'll show you that in a moment. We have a summary here of the vulnerabilities that we see across to include some of the KVs, and then where we are in terms of control effectiveness and currently, assets that we see have a possible breach impact based on those attack paths that we've built. Where your team started is starting with discovery, and we can do discovery either point in time. We have a flex discovery package, which requires no agents at all. It's something that your team can run off once, as a manual process, or through your ITSM processes, Chef, Intune, Puppet. We can deploy this and do massive discovery, so you can have that context through those processes. We can also do it in a continuous fashion. This is where we take, the deployment of an agent that's in the environment, which is used for validation, also to perform functions of discovery. And then the forms of the discovery come in the forms of doing discovery within your local Active Directory environment. We do so from the perspective of the local endpoints and do a bunch of discovery from the local endpoints themselves. We can also do discovery from an external perspective, targeting your CIDR blocks or applications. And then finally, from a local network perspective, we can do local scans in order to understand what services are running within your environment, as an example. The last type of discovery that we'll do is actually direct integrations with technology. This is where the permissions based kind of discovery comes into play. And we can go ahead and pull context from your vulnerability manager. We can pull context from some of your EDRs in order to help build this picture and this context here. Now, what do we do with the discovery data? To start, just to quickly show you just the raw data itself, we can see here, the details around your Active Directory, your network and services that were run there, like I was just talking about. But one thing I like to show off in this case, we're talking about actual physical machines and assets here. One thing that I like to call out in this example, this machine, Win11 Prod 5, you only see the little A there. So what that means is that right now, according to our processes, we've only been able to discover it through AttackIQ processes, likely a scan. But why is it that this is not showing up under manager for my vulnerability technology? Why is it not showing up under my EDR, right? So this is exactly, just with the discovery information alone and us deduping this information, we have some findings here that are pretty critical, right? This probably means that we're out of regulatory agreements that we've made with other organizations, businesses, and those sort of things, right? So yeah, Pete, anything you want to add here? I think this is a critical, simple but critical piece of information that we can find right away.
Yeah, and this has been the crux of sort of asset management in the past, right? And I'm not necessarily waving hands and saying, oh, a rogue asset, right? Because I don't have my controls deployed on it. But things get out of compliance, things get missed, packages fail, things disappear off the network and reappear after expiration dates and after tokens expire, like all of that stuff. One of the struggles of asset management in the past is keeping that data dynamic, like I had said before. With our technology, especially with agents deployed, and if you're doing that sort of automated Flex D stuff, the dynamic view of your asset environment is updated and refreshed continuously. It's super important at a glance to be able to look at an asset inventory and know right away I missed something or something seems off. So doing this across multiple dimensions and consuming data from multiple vendors and components and controls, I think gives you a sense of richness in asset discovery that's been really difficult to do in the past with the ServiceNows of the world, and so on and so forth. So this is much simpler, much more comprehensive, and much more continuous and dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the goal here. And now I've jumped to kind of the analysis piece. I kind of just wanted to show you that raw data because I feel there's a lot of value in just pulling that information and context into one place. But now when we get to the analysis pieces, we're actually taking that context and actually trying to make sense of it. And what we can see here is we'll do a breakdown of highest, high, and moderate kind of criticality of assets. And we take a look at the top highest criticality, and let's take a look at one example. Let's show you how we actually build that out and calculate it at that level in this place. And what we can see here is, this asset is holding about 42% of the risk within the organization, within the purview of what we saw here. And we're basing that, again, based on the context of the vulnerability data. Here we can see a number of KVs. We can see the current status of the control effectiveness. And then we can see, based on the attack paths, which I'll show you in a moment, what are the possible breach impact targets that are making up the score, making it raise up to the top. And you can see here, this asset is very highly rated, and hence why it's at the very top there. One thing I want to call out, here's a good example of the type of context and kind of cross communication that kind of gets lost, and we want to put it together. This has about 25 KEVs. These are all very, very low from a CVSS score perspective. However, right, we don't want to patch these in 90 days. We want to patch them now because they're actively being used as a threat. So this is one good example where if we take a look at just the perspective of the vulnerability and patch management program, it's just not in alignment with what we should be doing to maintain our safety here when it comes to CVSS. So now from here, what we'll do is we'll actually go ahead and create these attack paths with the context that I mentioned. Let's go ahead and show a few more attack paths here. And the idea is that we're building an attack path here, which in this case is targeting the system at the end, which is, has a high impact score in comparison with some of the others. What this is graphing out is all the different ways how we might be able to reach that system there at the end. But what we're doing is we're overlaying context here so your analysts can understand things. For example, in this case, we know that this is a possible viable attack path because that user has actually recently logged into that system. We can see the same thing with this user here as an example. Beyond that, we can see this as a green attack path. What this represents is initially we attempted to do a phishing, which is aligned with some of the threats that we've observed, and it was actually not being mitigated. But I've actually went ahead and changed the policy, and now it's actually being prevented. So what we're doing is we're validating out, is this attack path actually possible? And in this case, at least from an initial phishing perspective, we can confirm that it no longer is. But we still have all these other attack paths that we can validate. And then again, as we do validation for this point, anywhere else where we see the same type of jump, we can go ahead and update all the graphs so that your entire score and your entire plausible attack paths are updated based on this context. So here we can test, I haven't tested here, but we can test against credential theft. And I'll just show you the type of validations we have here. In my instance, in my environment, I still have to test against this. I haven't done that test. These are 3 areas that we found that the validations failed. These are areas of improvement. Again, these are tied to an attack path we just saw. So we probably want to address them. And then here we can see the phishing and then this other credential theft that we ran, which are confirmations and validations that those specific control capabilities are actually operational and working, at least in the environments that we tested. So again, as we run these tests, we can then calculate out or increase the risk based on when we see that. And we're doing further things like with the EDR, we're pulling in the policy and saying anywhere else where you see this attack with the same policy, right? Let's update that. And we give you the optionality of how you want to get those paths updated. But the idea here is that as you work through the area in one area, as you work through the problem in one area, we can see how it affects the rest of your organization, right? And show the work and the impact of that work through this process. Now, finally, I'm jumping to an overall overview, and this is the weaknesses that we were talking about earlier. As your team is either validating out or confirming that there's some issues based on these attackers, we can present to them, the weaknesses that we've observed. And here we have an example where we can look at the weaknesses from the perspective of MITRE ATT&CK, right? We can look at the weaknesses from the perspective of a control, right? Email threat versus something that the EDR ETP should address. Or if we're looking at someone that likes to focus on asset types, right? Cyber defense matrix is an example for a CISO that we can organize things in that way. And this is what we were talking about earlier, is making it easy to understand, translate it to the appropriate stakeholder. And with any one of these, we can give you full context and details of what the attack entails. Your team is going to have very detailed mitigations that they can follow, along with even technology-specific recommendations that they can implement, whether you're on CrowdStrike, Microsoft Defender Endpoint, any one of these technologies as an example. We're giving you the capabilities to improve, and then we'll give your team the raw results. So, as you're working with different groups, we talked about silos and working across groups. This is your evidence to show, right? This is why we're determining that this is possible. These are the actual logs, almost forensic level details that your team can follow. So all that context is there for you to build your case and work, across the aisle with the other team, right, as necessary there. So that essentially encompasses the CTEM capabilities that we have today. Of course, we're going to continue to improve these over time. But this is a way that we can take your context, build an attack path, help validate which ones are actually possible to then help you focus on what you should be focusing on and what matters to you is the idea there. That's actually all I have for today. Pete, any last words you want to leave the group with before we end it
Yeah, I
here?
just wanted to reinforce, what you're seeing here, taking it back to CTEM as a framework. Um, your ability to discover, your ability to prioritize based on a whole bunch of things that we just showed you, your ability to validate mitigants and interdiction, and your ability to create a game plan and actually move it forward and do something, yet providing context and providing human readable information. I mean, this is kind of game changing. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of all of the things that we worry about as CISOs. That translation layer, the prioritization across multiple teams, like we keep talking about, that sort of siloed nature. The executive buy-in, whatever it is. We spend a lot of money on a control. The control's not doing what we need it to do. Like, we need to address that and do something about it. Is it us? Is it them? Et cetera, et cetera. I think this kind of demystifies a lot of the things that we as CISOs have struggled with in the past, as far as getting that visibility, linking all of those things together through context and understanding, and bringing everybody else along. And I think that's the big thing not to take for granted. More resources and time have been spent trying to align and get people to understand and provide context. And I think what we're doing here is trying to solve that problem almost specifically.
Wonderful. Well, team, this is a pretty high-level overview. I think we just wanted to talk about the concepts. If you guys are interested in learning more, happy to get into the ones and zeros, the details, right? If you guys have any, just reach out to the team. Easy to reach out to me, Jose at attackiq.com. Pretty easy to remember. Happy to engage with you one-on-one as well, right, as we see that. So with that, let's actually spend the last few minutes here and just go over some of the questions that we've observed. So let's see what we have here. A complete attack path analysis dependent on the completeness of the discovery, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the more data that we give you, that you give us, the more context that we'll have in order to build some attack paths, right? If you run this on, being a little facetious here, but you run it on one machine as an example, right, in one environment, that's just not going to give us enough context so we can build the completeness. So the completeness is really dependent on the degree of context that you provide us, is what I would say to that one. Let's see, here we have another question. Do validations as shown in the demo require an agent to be on the exposed asset? Yes, they do. In order to, at least to run it from the interface itself, where you literally click run, we do need to have an agent on the other side. But I will share, we do have flex packages for all the content. So, if for whatever reason it's an environment where you don't want to have an agent on it or can't, then we have Flex, which is an agentless based solution. So you can do the test and bring that context back into the fold. So that would be how you would approach it that way. Let's see. Maybe this one for you, Pete. I'll read it live for you. So for within AttackIQ or potentially any other reporting format, is there an executive level report to show them the success or challenges of an assessment?
Yes. So across our product suite, there's multiple ways to report on findings. All of our products do come out of the box with executive level reporting. What you were just seeing in the demo, that B grade as an example. There's ways to extract information out of that platform that explains what that B grade means in a human readable way. As you kind of move up the stack in our product suite to more enterprise capable tools, a lot of the customization comes in our enterprise products and so on and so forth. But there is no shortage of reportability about the outcomes of assessments and sort of what it means, next steps, things that you should be considering. All of that stuff lives inside the platform and has tons of configurability for the CISO.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see. So let's see, does the platform integrate with Avanti to remediate CVEs using automation to reduce risk? I don't personally know that technology, but what I would say is AttackIQ is an API first company. So typically our customers will set up processes through like a SOAR technology to then do hooks with other technologies like that. So I've definitely seen that happen even outside of the realm of CTEM. As a result comes in, the customer will go change a policy through their own processes. So that's how we will typically, find that out. And then last question is how can a customer understand which technologies are supported in attack path analysis? For example, on-prem versus cloud, containers, identities, databases, with other cloud providers, Azure-specific resources, those sort of things. So we cover both of those things. I think if you give us the vulnerability data from those environments and do discoveries in those environments, we can support both, whether it's on-prem, whether it's Azure or another cloud service, we can support that. We do have some documentation on our website, but happy to, if you guys want very detailed for specific technologies, happy to have a conversation. Just reach out to us and we can send over a list. Don't want to just sit here and rattle out a bunch of technologies for the purposes of the conversation. And I think that's all I have for right now. I think for there is an ask around could we share materials and slides? We have a number of materials on the website. You can grab them that way directly, or just reach out to us and one of our teams can give you some slides accordingly. Well, thank you all for your time. I know taking 45 minutes out of your day is a lot. I have meetings the rest of the day myself, so really appreciate you spending the time with us. This is a developing area, I think, as an industry, right? But as Pete said, this is something that I think we've all been trying to do, right? This concept of big data, or on the business side, business intelligence. It's aggregation of data in order to give us the best visibility we can and make decisions about our business, or in the case of CTEM, make decisions about our security program. So we're striving to work towards that. We've done acquisitions, we've put this together. So definitely happy to work with the community as you guys have ideas. Happy to work with you guys to develop those through our product. So that's all we got. Thank you again for your time and enjoy the rest of your day. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.